Members of conference, guests, friends. I have been enormously touched and humbled by the number of people who have told me that they will be praying for me as I prepare to take up the privilege and responsibility of serving as Vice President of the Methodist Church for the coming year. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and please keep on praying. The trade union movement owes more to Methodism than it does to Marx. I am enormously proud of that. It draws many visitors to Anglesey Brook, where I am the director of a Heritage for Mission project which focuses on the story of primitive Methodism. One visitor memorably announced, "I am anti-God, but I'm a Methodist in my DNA." It was a great conversation starter. One of the questions I'm frequently asked is, where are the Methodist voices today? Now, they've heard of Donald Soper, but after that, I begin to struggle a bit. What is our distinctive Methodist voice? And how can we gain in confidence in sharing our own faith story? Now, a part of the problem, of course, is that we don't and can't speak with one voice. The strength of Methodism is that it's a democratic movement of people with many different views about how we should work out our Christian discipleship. But we can't stay silent. God calls us to speak out. It is not easy grappling with how to live with contradictory convictions, but that is our calling. How can we find our voice? I believe this is a key challenge if we are to make a difference to individual lives and bring hope to a world whose future is threatened by violence and climate change. So, I'm going to offer you my 4 Ps. Now, I like alliteration. And you should all have got a set of 4 postcards with my 4 Ps. Now, gloriously, there are so many, thousands of you here, that there weren't enough postcard sets to go wrong. So, very helpfully, someone behind the scenes has split them up, and you might, if you're lucky, have got 1 or 2 of them. And if you've come with someone else, it's a good party game you might like to play afterwards to see if you can swap them and end up with a full set. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. My first P is prophesy. Where are the Methodist voices? They are here. We can't pass the responsibility to someone else. God pours out his Spirit on each one of us, regardless of age, gender, sexual orientation, or ethnic background. We all have a unique story to share about the transforming love of God in our life. Equality and empowerment are at the heart of our Methodist identity. Lay people have a voice, as well as ordained people. At this point, perhaps I'll just sneak in. You may have noticed an extra chair being brought on. That is the Vice President's chair of the Primitive Methodists before Union. And just to say, the Primitive Methodists had vice presidents from 1872, which could actually be lay or ordained. The Wesleyans didn't have them, but at 1932, we've had vice presidents since, but they are lay. Anyway, enough of that. John Wesley accepted that women could have an extraordinary call. In the early 19th century, when the Wesleyans banned women from preaching, it was the Prims and Bible Christians who recognised that God pours out his Spirit on daughters as well as sons. Women were sent out as evangelists, speaking God's word in places that others sometimes feared to go. For the early Methodists, it didn't matter how old or how young you were. If you know the love of God in your heart, then stand up and share it, brother or sister. Now, in the little hamlet of Anglesey Brook, Sarah Smith, a farm labourer's wife, taught the children to read, and she also taught them how to pray. And she then started a prayer meeting in her cottage so that they could exercise their gifts. 6 of those children went on to become itinerant ministers, including Anne Brownsword and her brother Thomas, who was known as the boy preacher. And the youngest person I have found on a Methodist preaching plan is 11 years and 8 months. If anyone knows better than that, do let me know. There are no barriers to the outpouring of the Spirit. Desires, hopes, and dreams inspire action. What more can we do to empower older people to share their dreams and young people their visions? Now, the prophetic voice is often countercultural, subversive. Sometimes we don't listen to the right voices. To discern what the Spirit is saying to us as a church, we need to listen to the voices of those on the margins. Whose voice is ignored? Whose voice do we want to silence? We need to listen to the uncomfortable voices. And we need to take the risk of being hurt when we speak out and our voice is ignored or rejected. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances. My second P is pray. Finding our voice begins with prayer. To pray is to be immersed in the presence of God. Sarah Crosby, the first woman to convince John Wesley that she had a call to preach, had a passion for souls and the ability to attract and hold great crowds. She would start each day at 4 a.m. with an hour of prayer. And this gave her a constant sense of God's presence, which sustained her through the busiest times. She felt so surrounded and filled with the presence of God that she had a sense of calm even when speaking to large crowds like this. If we are to find our voice, first we need to pray. William Clowes, one of the founders of Primitive Methodists, was going to preach at Beverley, a 9-mile walk from his home in Hull. Now, when John Flesher, who was going with him, called for him, he was told that Clowes could not be disturbed. So later in the afternoon, Flesher came back again, only to receive the same answer. Well, by the time he called for the third time, there was no time to spare. But Clowes appeared from his room and greeted him with the words, "Flesher, I am supple with God." I love that image of prayer as our spiritual workout. I want to be supple with God. The early Methodists took prayer seriously. Now, one day in 1823, John Oxtoby, or Praying Johnny, as he was known, was at a meeting to discuss what to do about Filey, a fishing village. Oh, that's, you know, anybody from Filey here? Certainly from that district on the Yorkshire coast. Now, I'm sadly to say, all attempts at mission had met with such resistance that it was decided to abandon it altogether. Abandon Filey? John Oxtoby begged the meeting to just give it one last chance, and he would go himself. So they agreed to one last try. And when John reached the hill overlooking Filey, he knelt down to pray. And he told God that he, John Oxtoby, had made a promise that God would revive his work in Filey. And God must do it, or his servant would never be able to hold up his head again. At last he received an assurance from God and rose from his knees, saying, "Filey is taken." And that was the beginning of a remarkable revival. Now, John Oxtoby's relationship with God was based on hours of conversation with him. It said that he spent up to 6 hours a day in prayer. I'm not sure what else he did. Now, in 1832, a cholera epidemic swept the country and thousands died. And it was reported of one Methodist society in Yorkshire that only one praying man was left. Now, it didn't actually mean he was the only man left in the church. It meant there was only one man left who belonged to a praying band. Now, praying bands were as important as preachers. They used their voices at camp meetings and after services, praying people into the kingdom. Many people lack confidence in praying in public. I do myself. Now, after his conversion, Hugh Bourne shared his newfound faith with two of his friends, Daniel Shoebottom and Matthias Bailey, who were miners. Now, the two miners were talking together one night and decided they'd like to pray together, but they really weren't sure how to do it. Matthias found a prayer book, but he couldn't find a suitable prayer. So in the end, they decided they would just give it a go. And they plucked up courage and they found that God helped them. And that led to a prayer meeting in the cottage of a woman called Jane Hall in Harrisey Head. And they invited Hugh Bourne. But Hugh was then suddenly found that he was expected to pray. And actually, he'd never prayed in public before. And he was particularly nervous because Matthias went first, and Hugh Bourne thought it was the best prayer he'd ever heard. However, they sang, and Hugh Bourne followed. And he wrote in his journal, "The instant I began, heaven opened on my soul, and I felt the Lord had fitted me to be a praying labourer." Now, the next morning, Hugh Bourne told Daniel what a blessing he'd received from Matthias's prayer. "Why," said Daniel, "he isn't praying anymore because he can't pray as you did." The prayer meetings continued. The prayers grew in confidence. And in the words of Hugh Bourne, timid, inexperienced Christians were led to become energetic workers for Christ. Prayer is at the heart of our walk with God. What steps can we take to help each other to find our voice so that we can grow in confidence in praying with each other as we come to faith and grow as disciples in Christ? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. My third P is passion. If there's one word which runs through the early Methodists like a stick of rock, it's enthusiasm. They had a passion for sharing the good news with everyone they met. A bit like Steve Wilde, really. My grandson Edwin is not yet 2, and he is passionate about cooking. He sits on the floor with a saucepan and a wooden spoon, stirring away. His passion for cooking comes from copying his parents. We become passionate about loving others by loving God and staying close to him, watching what he does. God's love is not half-hearted, but extravagant. He gives everything of himself to us. We're called to love the Lord our God with all our heart. And when we come to know the love of Christ for ourselves, we want to share that joy with others. At Anglesey Brook, we have a display of loving cups, or love feast cups. And one day, this sparked a visitor to tell me his story. The moment I set out on my path to being a Christian was at a love feast. I was 5 or 6 years old and sitting on my mother's lap. There was a window with rectangles of red and blue glass, and the sun was shining through. An old man stood up, and the light surrounded his white hair, and there were the vivid colours of the red and blue. And he said, "I want to tell you about my Jesus." And I thought, I want some of that. I want to tell you about my Jesus. Now that reminded me of Steve Wilde. He has, and we've already heard him do it, he has an endearing way of talking about his lovely wife as my Laura. And I find that really moving, because those words convey the depth of his love for her. Are we prepared to tell others about my Jesus? Now, a real delight for me this year has been meeting Megan Thomas, our youth president, and being inspired by her love for Jesus. And telling me about her experiences, this is something she said. I've discovered that if I ask people about their grandchildren, their faces light up and they can't wait to tell me about them. Any news? We've got one very nervous prospective grandpa here. As a grandma myself, I found myself going for my phone. I was all about to show Megan the photos of my lovely grandchildren. And then she brought me up short. What she said was, if only we could share our love for Jesus like that. Speak out for those who cannot speak. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. My fourth P is protest. Now, if we are passionate about loving God and loving our neighbour, we have to speak out for those who have no voice. For those with mental health issues who have had their benefits sanctioned. For the 1 million people living in poverty who have to use food banks. For migrants seeking a better life and a means to support their families. For Pacific Islanders who are suffering from the effects of climate change. Loving our neighbour means being concerned for the weakest and most vulnerable in our society, both locally and globally. It means speaking out on their behalf. It means challenging systems that enslave people. Now, this is where it gets messy. Should Christians get involved in politics? Yes. We have a proud heritage of Methodists at the heart of local government. One of my heroines, Charlotte Edwards, in Norfolk, one of the first district women councillors, challenged and changed the unjust system of paying poor relief in kind, and the unjust treatment of unmarried mothers in workhouses. Methodist local preachers became the first trade union leaders, men like Tommy Hepburn and the Durham miners, and Joseph Arch and the agricultural workers. And most of the first working class MPs were Methodists. Have we lost that passion for living out the gospel through social and political action? Is there a danger that we've privatised our faith so that it makes us feel better as individuals, but we fail to relate it to wider community and global concerns? I want to call on Methodists to get involved in local and national politics, to become a voice for change, challenging the politics of self-interest and upholding the politics of the common good. One way we can have a voice is by writing to our MP. Our MPs represent us in decisions that are made in Parliament. How will they know our views unless we tell them? If we lack confidence in understanding the wider issues, there is help at hand. JPIT, the Joint Public Issues Team of the Methodists, Baptists, URC and now the Church of Scotland, produce a newsletter, Praxis. And this keeps me up to date with key issues and provides templates for action. And if you haven't read JPIT's latest report on benefit sanctions, then please do. It shows that they disproportionately impact the most vulnerable people, affecting 100,000 children last year. At times, the church has been very risk-averse. In the early 19th century, new chapels were even named Hanover or Brunswick, sorry if that's the name of your chapel, after the royal family, to demonstrate that Methodists were loyal citizens. In 1819, in Manchester, protesters met in St. Peter's Fields to call for parliamentary reform. 15 people were killed and 400 to 700 injured after the cavalry charged into the crowd. 400 Wesleyan Methodists were excluded from the church for speaking out against the Peterloo massacre. In 2015, in Manchester, protesters set up a tent camp in St. Peter's Square to call for proper support for homeless people following £2 million cuts in funding. I was really challenged when my friend Susan asked me, with the homeless who set up their tent camp in Manchester, where is the church in this? What if all the Christians stood in solidarity with these people? What if? Civil disobedience may be a necessary part of Christian discipleship. Speaking out can get us into trouble. Although today, I hope we would not be excluded from the Methodist Church. Methodists have a history of passive resistance. In the early 20th century, many faced imprisonment for non-payment of taxes in protests at the government's education policy. In 2014, one of our Methodist ministers in training was arrested for taking part in a demonstration against the arms trade. Who is God calling you to speak out for? Finally, I want to tell you about Dorothy Ripley, whose story has inspired me and which shows that we don't need to wait for the church to speak out. We just need to obey God's call and find our own voice. Now, Dorothy Ripley lived in Whitby, where her father actually built the first Methodist church, and John Wesley was a frequent visitor to their home. Dorothy experienced a call to preach, but as a woman, the church wouldn't accept her. One day, while she was praying, Dorothy heard God calling her to go to America to preach freedom for enslaved people and convict slaveholders of their sin so that they would set people free. Now, this was before the anti-slavery society in England, let alone America. But Dorothy felt she had to obey God's call. A single woman with no money, she set out to walk to London to find a boat that would take her to America. Eventually, she found a Quaker sea captain in Bristol who would take her. Now, on arriving in America, Dorothy decided what she must do first is go to Washington to tell the president what she planned to do. Well, everybody thought she was mad and tried to persuade her not a good idea. But Dorothy said she had to obey God, not man. Now, amazingly, Dorothy Ripley got an interview with Thomas Jefferson. And she had the courage to ask him about his own slaveholding, urging him to have compassion for his 300 slaves. And she asked him for his approval for her mission. He warned her that she'd have an uphill struggle, but apparently they parted in peace. Then Dorothy decided to make her base in Charleston, the stronghold of southern slavery. And of course, that place is very much in our minds at the moment. It's very sad to think that its legacy lives on. It's still with us. It was in Charleston that 9 people were killed last week in a racial attack at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. For Dorothy, and imagine it was an immensely brave decision to make her base in Charleston. And she narrowly escaped several attempts on her life. Now, Dorothy must have made an enormous impression on Thomas Jefferson, because in 1806, she became the first woman to speak to Congress. Apparently, she preached to a crowded audience with the same evangelical fervour as if she was at a camp meeting. This Dorothy saw herself, first of all, as an evangelist. She travelled for over 30 years throughout America and crossed the Atlantic at least 9 times. It's interesting that in 1818, we actually find her in Nottinghamshire, where she opened the first primitive Methodist chapel in the county at Bingham, and afterwards was thrown into prison for open-air preaching and inciting a riot. She was an amazing woman who was not owned by the church because her voice was too radical. Dorothy Ripley was a woman of prayer and lived by what she called the bank of faith. She had a passion for sharing the love of God with others. She acted on God's call to love her neighbour and spoke out for those who did not have a voice. She was prepared to challenge individual sin and sinful systems that enslaved people. She changed lives. God calls you and me to find our voice.
the journey to Emmaus, with our hearts gone as storm, the one who would save us had left us alone. Then a stranger walks with us, and to our surprise, he opens our stories, and he opens our eyes. And our hearts burn within us as we talked on the way, how all that was promised was ours on that day. Stay with us and grant us your word. We welcome the stranger, and we welcome the Lord. And that evening at the table, as he blessed